Hi dear friends, welcome to the CSS Learners Academy. In the last lecture, we have discussed the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms or the Indian Consuls Act of 1919. Today we are going to talk about some other important events in 1919 and 1920 as well. From 1919, we will discuss the Rowlatt Act of 1919 and the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre. Whereas after that, we will discuss the three important movements of the Indian subcontinent known as the NonCooperation Movement, the Khilafat Movement and the Hijrat Movement. Talking about the Rowlat Act was basically not a new kind of act which was promulgated with the help of the Legislative Council which were established in the aftermath of Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. Basically, Rowlatt Act was an extension of the previous Indian Defence Act of 1915. As we all know that there was World War I, a crisis that British government was facing. That World War I was from 1914 to 1918, and during the period of war, special type of legislations have always been made in all the countries to control the internal unrest, the expected unrest among the people. As they say that extraordinary measures are required to be taken in the extraordinary circumstances. So war basically is a kind of extraordinary circumstances. But in the normal condition, if you apply the same rules and regulations to the people and you restrict them, then it is obviously not acceptable anywhere in the world. That happened in the case of Rowlatt Act of 1919. The other name or the actual name of this act was the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act 1919. It was passed in March 1919 by the Imperial Legislative Council. Now the people, the local people, we can say that who were the members of the Imperial Legislative Council, they resigned as a kind of they never backed such kind of a legislation. But as we were talking about the lacunas of the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms or the Indian Consuls Act, it was possible for the Viceroy to promulgate the laws nonetheless. There are some important provisions of the Rowlatt Act. This act authorized the British government to arrest anybody suspected of terrorist activities. It also authorized the government to detain such people arrested for up to 2 years without any trial. It empowered the police to search for a place without a warrant. It also placed severe restrictions on the freedom of press. Now you see that these kind of things were actually a green signal for the British government. Whoever they think might be a part of conspiracy, he can be arrested and he can be detained for 2 years without a chance of a trial. Why was this happening especially at that time? Because the British had already observed in 1909 and 1919 that the legislations, if the legislations are not in favor of the people, they will boycott such kind of rules and they will stand against the British government. And secondly, it was also important for the British not to give authority or autonomy to the people, because they never thought of Indian subcontinent anything other than a colony. So here we see that right after the promulgation of Indian Consuls Act of 1919, the Rowlatt Act was passed and it was rightly implemented. The second important factor is the changes that were going on the international forum. As we have talked in the last lecture about the Russian Revolution and then the Bolshevik Revolution, and likewise the movements, nationalist movements all across the Europe, they were influencing the Indian subcontinent, and it was very difficult for British to keep control of the Indian subcontinent in the way that they wanted to. I mean, a total autocratic type of government was not in favor of Indian subcontinent, and the two political parties, important political parties, the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League, were well aware of the fact, and that's why they were going to boycott the British government. So keeping in view these two aspects, the British government applied the Rowlatt Act of 1919, and even they made arrests after that. And then we see that as a kind of opposition to the Rowlatt Act, we see that Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Mazharul Haq and other prominent leaders of the Imperial Legislative Council resigned from their posts. And as we know that people were opposing the Rowlatt Act all across the Indian subcontinent in the same scenario. But another important factor is that the media or other sources were not present at that time as they are today. So many people were not aware of what British government is doing and how it is going to affect the people. Meanwhile, the common people used to celebrate a festival known as Baisakhi. It was the same sad incident, a tragedy we would like to say, which is known as the Jallianwala Massacre that happened on this event. On the 13th of April 1919, people were gathered in the Jallianwala Bagh in Amritsar to celebrate Baisakhi. The Jallianwala Bagh, it was surrounded by the buildings from three corners, and only one was open, which was used as entrance and exit. The British government had already imposed a curfew, but people, they were not aware of the Rowlatt Act and the subsequent curfew that was imposed. So people gathered there, the armless people, the weaponless people, obviously, the harmless people, they were gathered to celebrate the Baisakhi festival. The Lieutenant Governor of Punjab at that time was Michael O'Dwyer. So Dyer ordered the troops to close the entrance and to start shooting the people. As it was reported by the sources of British government themselves, that the indiscriminate firing went on for about 10 minutes until 1650 rounds of ammunition were exhausted. This incident resulted in the deaths of thousands of people and thousands other were injured. All the leaders of Indian subcontinent raised their voice against this incident, and especially when Michael Dyer was appreciated by the British government for his swift action against the harmless people. Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhi, they even gave back their titles. Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Ali brothers, they initiated a mass movement later to be known as the Non-Cooperation Movement. The Non-Cooperation Movement was soon joined by Gandhi and other leaders of Congress. As we all know that the Hindu-Muslim unity initiated by Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah in the Lucknow Pact of 1916 was short-lived, but it was a period when it was alive. It was in 1919, and the Hindu-Muslim unity, we have seen Hindu-Muslim unity at its peak. So the Non-Cooperation Movement and then the Khilafat Movement, they were the direct result of the British atrocides. Now we will discuss about the Non-Cooperation Movement and then the Khilafat Movement. So the Non-Cooperation Movement was started, which was basically a kind of peaceful movement against the British rule, but it was launched jointly by the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League. Therefore it was pretty effective unless the Congress leaders unilaterally ended up the movement in 1922. So now we will discuss some important points of the Non-Cooperation Movement. Indians were asked to relinquish their titles and resign from nominated seats in the local bodies as a mark of protest. People were asked to resign from the government jobs. They were asked to withdraw their children from the government-controlled schools, to boycott the foreign goods, and to boycott the elections. So here we see that the Non-Cooperation Movement was a kind of protest by the people of Indian subcontinent, mainly because after the World War I was ended, the promises that the British government made with the Indian people, they were not fulfilled. That in the next act, which was going to be the Indian Councils Act of 1919, more and more autonomy will be given to the Indian people. But as we have seen in the last lecture, that this did not happen. Secondly, it was promised, especially to the Muslims, that the Ottoman Empire will not be harmed in any way, because the Muslims, As we know that in the World War I, the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire were the members or the allies with Germany. Now they lost the war, and therefore it was evident that now British will go and penalize the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire to stand with Germany. Therefore, the Muslims of Indian subcontinent, they were not ready to join the British troops unless they gave assurances that the Ottoman Empire will not be harmed. The British gave the assurances, but after 1918 we see that the Ottoman Empire was dismantled. So this resulted in the Khilafat movement. The non-cooperation movement and the Khilafat movement, they were running side by side. So I would like to say that you should not confuse between the two movements. It was a period, as I was saying, that it was a period of the height of Hindu-Muslim unity, and both were cooperating with each other. So they are a kind of movements by different parties. I mean, Congress was more enthusiastic about the non-cooperation movement because the Hindus and Sikh people were killed in the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, and Muslims were more supportive of the Khilafat movement because they were related to the Ottoman Empire. But both of these movements were jointly running all across India, and it was a blow to the British government. As a result of non-cooperation movement and Khilafat movement, many prominent leaders of Indian National Congress and All India Muslim League were arrested using the same Rowlatt Act of 1919, but nonetheless they had impacted the Indian subcontinent, the mentality of the people of Indian subcontinent at a greater extent. So now we will try to discuss the Khilafat movement. So as we have discussed that the Muslims who were in the British army, they were not ready to fight against the Ottoman Empire unless the British gave assurances that they are just required to fight Germany and Turkey will not be harmed. I mean, the Ottoman Empire will not be harmed. But afterwards, as we see that the war was ended and British went on with their plan to dismantle the Ottoman Empire ultimately. Khilafat movement started, basically the role was played by the Ali brothers, Maulana Muhammad Ali Johar and Maulana Shaukat Ali. They were the strongest proponents of the Khilafat movement. The Congress also raised their voice and joined the Muslim League in this Khilafat movement. As I was saying earlier, that the two movements were running side by side all across the Indian subcontinent. A special committee was made by the leaders of the Indian subcontinent, who then went to Britain to talk to the Prime Minister of Britain himself. So in the House of Commons, they gave speeches and told the Prime Minister what the Muslims were promised by the Viceroy of India, but the promise was not fulfilled. But there, unfortunately, they find out that even the Prime Minister was not interested. He never gave any kind of assurances. And after getting a setback from there, the Indian leaders, they stayed at there for 8 months, gathering the public support, and they gathered the support of masses. But after that, they returned back in India in October, and they find out that the British government is not going to support them, is not going to fulfill their promises. Therefore, the movement was launched against the British rule, and it was a kind of protest where where all the Indian people gave all their titles back to the British government. They boycott the schools, they boycott colleges, and they boycott even the elections. So after that kind of a massive boycott, British government was forced to think once again about their strategy. Another important incident happened in the same period in 1920, which is known as the Hijrat movement. Hijrat movement was basically initiated by the Islamist factions of Indian subcontinent when they declared the Indian subcontinent as Darul Harb. Darul Harb means the place of war. And according to the Muslim sentiments, they stated that you cannot live in Darul Harb, you should live in Darul Aman. Darul Aman means the place of peace. Now, the Muslims who were living there in India, they were forced, or you can say that they were advocated, or they were given an opportunity to migrate from the Indian subcontinent to anywhere that they like. For the people of India, Afghanistan was the best option. So the massive movements of migration started. Nazims were, deputed in different areas, who were given the responsibility to look after the Hijrat movement. The people were motivated that they should not live in Darul Harb and they should go back to anywhere which they found as Darul Aman. Common Muslims, the simple people, they sold out all their properties and their lands and their cattle, and they moved or migrated towards Afghanistan. In the initiation of the movement, they opened their ways and they welcomed the people from coming from India. But according to an estimate, there were more than 30,000 people migrating from India to Afghanistan. It was obviously not possible for Afghanistan. Therefore, Afghanistan announced that we are not going to allow anyone to come to Afghanistan afterwards. Now, Indian Muslims, they were in severe trouble because they could not go back to India where they have sold everything, and they could not go to Afghanistan as well. Some of them settled down in Afghanistan, some of them even go to Soviet Union, some of them went to Europe, and all the Muslims population, they were scattered. So we see that the Hijrat movement was a failure, it was not a success, and because of the mismanagement, the Muslims faced a very severe blow. But we cannot say that it was a total failure, because it was helpful in that strengthening of that ideology which the Muslims were working on, that Muslims are a separate community and they cannot live with any other entity, with any other community in the same homeland. So this kind of attitude was developed further. So here we have discussed the 5 important things: the Rowlat Act of 1919, the Jallianwala Bagh Massacre, and the 3 movements known as the Non-Cooperation Movement, the Khilafat Movement, and the Hijrat Movement. In the next lecture, we will discuss the events when the Simon Commission arrived in India, as it had to arrive after the 10 years of 1919. It was mentioned in Montague Chelmsford reforms, as I was talking earlier. So they came 2 years earlier in 1927. So we will discuss the Simon Commission and the subsequent opportunity given to the Indian leaders, and then the 14 points of Quaid-e-Azam Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Nehru Report, 3 roundtable conferences, and obviously Khutbah Allahabad of 1930, which I think proved to be the base of the Lahore Resolution, later to be discussed in 1940. So the people who have not subscribed my channel until this moment, I will like you to say that you should subscribe. We are not discussing according to the syllabus of Pakistan affairs. It is just a brief introduction of the history of Pakistan for the beginners, so that you might have a general concept of what happened, and then I am trying to cover it up as soon as possible, so that we can start the actual syllabus, we can start the actual topics of Pakistan affairs, and I hope that it will happen very soon. Thank you very much for watching. Stay blessed. Allah Hafiz.